Before we begin, Samantha, let me ask you to listen differently tonight, not as a judge, not as a student of history, but as someone sitting in the dark, watching a city breathe. Imagine Rome at night. The streets are quieter than the stories would have you believe. Torches flicker, stone still holds the day's warmth. Somewhere far away, water moves through pipes laid generations ago by men long forgotten. Now imagine a name being whispered, not shouted, not carved in stone, just spoken softly, as if saying it too loudly might wake something. Nero. You already think you know him. History has made sure of that. But tonight, don't hold on to the version you were given. Set it down gently. Instead, ask yourself something simple as you listen. What happens to a child raised inside applause? Point. What happens to a ruler who learns early that love arrives louder than truth? And what happens to a city that demands perfection and punishes humanity? This is not a story about flames. It is a story about expectation. So settle in, let the noise of the world fade, and as Rome slowly rises around us, allow yourself to listen, not for judgment, but for understanding. Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history doesn't shout, it whispers. A child born into a burning line. Nero did not arrive into the world with fire around him. That part came later. He was born instead into salt air and soft light in the coastal town of Antium, where the sea moved slowly and the villas of Rome's most powerful families lined the shore like calm masks. On the 15th day of December, in the year 37 AD, a child was born into comfort, privilege, and a family already trembling under the weight of its own history. From the beginning, Nero's life was shaped less by affection than by inheritance. In Rome, blood was never just blood, it was memory, it was claim, it was a dangerous thing to carry. His name at birth was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. That name mattered. Roman names were not personal labels the way we think of them now. They were signals. Each part told a story about ancestry, alliances, and expectation. Domitius tied him to an old aristocratic line. Ahenobarbus, meaning bronze-bearded, carried echoes of a proud and sometimes violent family past. Long before he would become Nero, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, his name already placed him on a political map. Antium itself was not chosen by chance. Roman elites fled there when Rome felt too loud, too dangerous, too unstable. The city was close enough to remain connected, far enough to breathe. Augustus had favored it. Caligula was born there. To be born in Antium was to be born slightly apart from Rome, but never outside its reach. Nero's first cries echoed not in the crowded streets of the capital, but in a villa built for retreat, the kind of place people used when they wanted to survive power rather than chase it. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, understood this better than anyone. Agrippina was not merely well-born, she was surrounded by ghosts. She was the daughter of Germanicus, Rome's most beloved general, a man whose popularity had once frightened emperors. Even years after his death, crowds still spoke his name with warmth. His image lingered in statues, coins, and public memory. But being Germanicus's daughter meant carrying a kind of emotional authority that no law could grant and no Senate vote could remove. Agrippina also happened to be the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. That detail mattered more than affection ever could. Augustus had built the system Nero would inherit, a world where emperors pretended not to be kings and families pretended power passed naturally. In truth, adoption, ceremony, and performance mattered more than blood. Agrippina knew this. She had watched it play out since childhood. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was less fortunate in reputation. Ancient writers described him as harsh, unpredictable, and violent. Whether these accounts were fair or shaped by later hostility toward Nero is difficult to say. Roman historians rarely resisted the temptation to turn fathers into foreshadowing. What matters is that Nero's father died when the boy was still young, removing one influence but also removing protection. That left Nero alone with his mother's world. When Caligula ruled, fear ruled with him. Exile became a routine punishment, a way to erase rivals without bloodshed while still destroying them. Agrippina was accused of conspiracy and sent away. Nero was separated from her before he was old enough to understand why. Property was seized. Status was stripped. This was not unusual. It was how Rome worked when suspicion became policy. For a time, Nero lived in the shadows of other households, passed between relatives, watched but not celebrated. He was raised during a period when survival depended on invisibility. What children learned early when to speak and when to remain silent. These were lessons Rome taught without ceremony. Everything changed when Claudius became emperor. Claudius was an unlikely ruler, mocked for his physical weaknesses and speech, underestimated by nearly everyone. Yet he understood administration, law, and procedure. His court became a place where freedmen, former slaves like Narcissus and Pallas, managed the machinery of empire. These men would shape Nero's future as much as any general. Agrippina returned from exile and reclaimed her son. She also began working again. Her strategy was never reckless. She did not rush. She aligned. She observed. She understood that in Rome, power came not from shouting, but from appearing necessary. Claudius's court was crowded with rivals, but Agrippina carried something they did not: a child who could be shaped into Rome's future. The Senate still existed. It still met. It still spoke of tradition and shared authority. Yet everyone understood that the real decisions happened elsewhere. The princeps, the first man, balanced ceremony with control. Agrippina positioned Nero carefully within that balance, presenting him not as a threat but as continuity. When Claudius adopted Nero, the boy's identity changed. Adoption in Rome was not about care, it was about succession. Nero became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. His name expanded, absorbing legitimacy. With that act, he stepped into a lineage that linked him to Augustus, to Germanicus, and to the ruling house itself. Coins soon carried his image. Public appearances followed. Ceremonies multiplied. None of this was accidental. Rome believed what it could see repeatedly. Agrippina made sure Nero was seen. Yet even in these early years, tension hovered. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, still lived. He represented a different future. Nero represented a chosen one. Rome had seen this before. Chosen sons often replaced biological ones. It rarely ended quietly. Nero was still a child, but the world around him was already sharpening. This is where his story truly begins, not with fire, not with music, not with cruelty, but with a system that demanded symbols, airs, and performances long before it cared about character. Nero did not choose this role. It was prepared for him, named for him, and placed around him like a garment he could never fully remove. And as Rome watched this boy grow, it began projecting its fears and hopes onto him. That projection would shape everything that followed. Agrippina's design power in Rome was rarely announced. It arrived quietly, settled into routines, and only later revealed how complete it had become. Agrippina understood this long before her son ever understood Rome itself. She had learned it as a child, watching her mother survive the imperial court. She learned it again through exile, confiscation, and loss. And when she returned prepared. Agrippina did not rule through offices or decrees, she ruled through timing. Her first task was to make Nero visible without making him threatening. Rome distrusted ambition when it appeared too early. Children of noble houses were meant to be seen, not heard. Agrippina respected this rule outwardly, even as she bent it underneath. To Nero was placed with tutors chosen not only for education, but for loyalty. His supervision passed through freedmen connected to Claudius's inner circle, men who understood paperwork, schedules, and access. In Rome, access was everything. Claudius's court was not run by senators alone. It functioned through a network of former slaves who knew how the empire worked in practice. Men like Pallas and Narcissus controlled correspondence, finances, and information. Agrippina aligned herself with them not by force but by usefulness. She offered something valuable, a future emperor shaped within their system. At the same time, she understood the danger of being too visible. Claudius's wife, Messalina, still held the title of empress, and she was not a woman to ignore rivals. Messalina used accusation as a weapon, often deadly. Agrippina survived by appearing harmless. She stayed quiet. She waited. Nero, meanwhile, was growing in a Rome that valued symbols more than sincerity. Every public appearance was measured. Every ceremony mattered. When Nero appeared at public games, he did not simply attend. He was observed. Crowds noticed him. Applause followed. Whether spontaneous or encouraged hardly mattered. What mattered was the impression left behind. Roman legitimacy did not come from affection alone. It came from repetition. If people saw a boy often enough beside the emperor, they began to accept him as part of the structure. Agrippina made sure this happened. The turning point came with Messalina's fall. Her execution shocked Rome, but it also cleared space. Suddenly, Claudius was without a wife, and the question of succession returned with urgency. While Claudius was aging, his son Britannicus was still young. Rome disliked uncertainty, especially after years of Caligula's chaos. Agrippina stepped forward carefully. She was not the only candidate for marriage, but she was the most effective. She brought with her a son already known to the public, already linked to Germanicus, already accepted by crowds. She also brought reassurance. Her lineage connected Claudius directly back to Augustus, something the Senate and people found comforting. The marriage required special approval. Roman custom frowned upon unions between uncle and niece. Yet custom in Rome had always bent when power demanded it. The Senate was persuaded. Claudius agreed. Agrippina became empress. From that moment, Nero's rise accelerated. Adoption followed quickly. Claudius formally adopted Nero, placing him ahead of Britannicus in age, position, and preparation. This was not unusual in Roman history, but it was decisive. Adoption carried more weight than blood. It rewrote the future. With adoption came new names, new titles, new expectations. Nero's identity expanded again, absorbing Claudius's authority. Coins soon reflected this change. In some, Agrippina and Nero appeared together, facing one another as equals. This was unprecedented. It was also deliberate. The message was quiet but unmistakable. Mother and son were a unit. Rome noticed. Agrippina did not remove Britannicus openly. That would have caused resistance. Instead, she isolated him. Tutors were dismissed. Supporters were reassigned. Key positions around the boy were filled with men loyal to her and Claudius's administration. Britannicus remained present, all but diminished. Meanwhile, Nero was advanced publicly. He was promised future offices far earlier than custom required. He was granted honors normally reserved for adults. None of this was rushed. Each step was justified. Each honor was framed as preparation, not favoritism. The Senate played its role. It debated, it approved, it applauded. Senators understood the direction events were taking. Resisting would have required unity they did not possess. Agrippina also understood the importance of restraint. She did not dominate every moment. She allowed Nero to appear independent. She allowed Seneca to return from exile and take on the role of tutor, adding philosophical respectability to Nero's education. She supported the appointment of Burrus as Praetorian prefect, ensuring loyalty without brutality. These were not emotional decisions, but they were structural ones. By the time Nero reached adolescence, Rome was already accustomed to the idea of his rule. His presence in the Senate, his speeches written with care, his appearances beside Claudius during illness and ceremony, all reinforced the same idea: continuity. Britannicus remained alive, but the momentum had shifted. Rome had accepted a narrative before fully questioning it. Agrippina had achieved what few ever did. She had shaped the future without announcing it. Nero was no longer merely her son. He was Rome's expectation. Yet beneath this success lay a quiet instability. Nero was growing up surrounded by performance. Every word spoken for him, every gesture planned, every honor arrived early. Rome was teaching him a lesson it would later resent, that applause was earned through display, not patience. Point: Agrippina believed she was securing her son's survival. In truth, she was also teaching him how power felt when it arrived easily. That feeling would matter later. For now, Rome watched a young prince move closer to the center, believing it was witnessing order return after chaos. Few noticed how much depended on one woman's calculations. Fewer still considered what would happen when the child shaped by those calculations finally stood alone. That moment was approaching, becoming a man in public. In Rome, childhood did not end quietly. It ended in front of witnesses. For Nero, growing older was never a private experience. Every step toward adulthood unfolded beneath watchful eyes, measured not by age alone but by readiness to serve the state. This was a city that believed maturity could be announced, confirmed, and accepted through ritual. And so when the time came for Nero to assume the toga virilis, it was not treated as a family milestone. It was treated as a signal. The toga of manhood transformed boys into citizens. It granted legal standing, access, and expectation. When Nero exchanged his childhood clothing for that plain white garment, Rome did not see a teenager finding his place. It saw a future ruler stepping into view. The ceremony itself was carefully managed. Priests, magistrates, and senators attended. The people watched. Applause followed. Rome was learning to recognize him not just as Agrippina's son, but as a public figure. What made this moment unusual was how much arrived alongside it. Nero was still young, yet he was already promised offices normally reserved for seasoned men. He was named consul designate years in advance. When he was granted imperium beyond the city, authority that extended outward into the provinces, titles gathered around him like protective armor. Each one added weight. Each one shortened the distance between expectation and reality. These honors were legal, they were justified, they were also strategic. In Rome, power functioned through balance. The Senate still debated, voted, and advised. The princeps still spoke of cooperation. Yet everyone understood that the structure leaned toward one man. Nero's elevation signaled continuity rather than rupture. He looked prepared. He sounded composed. His speeches were polished, measured, and calm, shaped by tutors who understood what senators wanted to hear. Seneca's influence was clear. Language mattered, tone mattered. Nero learned how to thank the Senate without surrendering authority. Point: he learned how to appear modest while standing at the center of attention. These lessons were not philosophical exercises, they were survival skills. Britannicus, by contrast, receded further into the background. This did not happen through spectacle or accusation, it happened through absence. Britannicus appeared less often. His name carried less weight in public settings. His supporters were quietly reassigned. He remained present in name, but not in momentum. Rome did not see him vanish. It simply stopped looking at him. The Senate noticed. Senators always did. Yet few objected. The system rewarded cooperation. Opposition required risk, and risk rarely came with reward. Nero's first appearances before the Senate reinforced the image being built around him. When Claudius fell ill, Nero offered public vows for his recovery. When cities petitioned for relief after disaster, Nero spoke on their behalf. Sometimes he addressed the Senate in Greek, a reminder of his education and cultural breadth. These moments were carefully chosen. They displayed competence without arrogance. The city responded. Rome respected ritual. It trusted patterns. Nero was performing his role well, yet beneath the surface, tension persisted. Public authority arrived early. Private identity lagged behind. Nero was praised before he had earned experience. He was elevated before he had tested limits. The applause came easily. The restraint that once surrounded him weakened. Agrippina watched closely. She had designed this path, but she was not blind to its risks. Early favor could breed impatience. Power granted without resistance could feel natural rather than conditional. Still, she pressed forward. Better to secure position now than gamble later. The Praetorian Guard also adjusted. Loyalty followed visible power. Burrus ensured stability, maintaining discipline while reinforcing Nero's status among the soldiers. Donatives were promised. Ceremony reinforced allegiance. The Guard did not merely protect emperors, it chose them. Rome's people followed suit. Nero's presence at public games brought enthusiasm. He was young, handsome, and familiar. His lineage reassured older generations. His visibility appealed to younger ones. He represented renewal without uncertainty. For a time, the balance held. Yet the shape of Nero's authority was becoming clear. It was not grounded in conquest or reform. It was grounded in performance. Rome rewarded the ability to appear ready. Nero had learned that lesson well, and the Senate continued to meet. Laws continued to pass. But Nero was no longer simply learning the system. He was becoming part of it. And systems shape behavior as much as individuals shape systems. When Claudius left the city for religious festivals, Nero was appointed prefect in his absence. It was a symbolic role, but symbolism mattered. It placed Nero in charge of Rome itself, even if only briefly. Each such moment reinforced inevitability. Britannicus remained alive, but increasingly irrelevant. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere shifted. Advisors began adjusting their loyalty. Courtiers recalibrated their futures. Rome had seen this pattern before. Once inevitability took hold, resistance faded. Nero, still young, absorbed all of this without fully understanding its cost. Praise surrounded him. Criticism softened. The boundaries blurred. He was learning how power felt, not how it failed. And that distinction would matter later. For now, Rome believed it was preparing a ruler carefully. Agrippina believed she was securing her son's safety. The Senate believed stability had returned. Each believed a version of the same story. But stories in Rome rarely stayed true for long. As Nero stepped further into public life, the gap between expectation and self widened. He was becoming a man in the eyes of Rome. What kind of man he would become remained uncertain. The next stage would test not his preparation, but his restraint. The calm years, Rome would later miss. For a brief moment, Rome exhaled. When Nero finally became emperor in 54 AD, the city did not erupt in fear or resistance. There were no barricades, no riots, no desperate speeches from the Senate. Instead, there was relief. After years shaped by Caligula's terror and Claudius's uneasy rule, Rome welcomed a ruler who looked young, composed, and promising. Nero was only 16, but he arrived already surrounded by reassurance. The transition itself was handled with care. The Praetorian Guard pledged loyalty quickly. The Senate confirmed his powers without hesitation. Titles were granted in the familiar rhythm Rome had come to expect. Nero declined some honors at first, not out of reluctance, but as a gesture of restraint. Romans appreciated this kind of performance. It suggested humility without weakness. From the outset, Nero spoke the language the Senate wanted to hear. He promised cooperation rather than domination. He spoke against secret trials and abuses of power, and he positioned himself as a guardian of law rather than its master. These words mattered. Rome remembered how easily justice had been twisted into terror under previous emperors. Nero's assurance that accusations of treason would no longer be encouraged was met with quiet approval. Much of this tone came from his advisors. Seneca, the philosopher, helped shape Nero's public voice. His speeches emphasized moderation, mercy, and balance. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, ensured discipline among the guards while keeping them loyal without excess. Together they formed a protective layer between the young emperor and the machinery of power. Agrippina remained present, but her role was shifting. In the early months, she appeared alongside Nero in ceremonies and on coinage, signaling continuity and shared authority. Yet even then, the balance was changing. Nero was emperor now. Agrippina could advise, but she could no longer command openly. This subtle shift would later become a source of tension, but at first, it worked. The Senate noticed that Nero attended meetings, listened, and responded. He allowed debate. He did not punish disagreement. Senators who had lived under constant suspicion found this unfamiliar and comforting. Nero appeared approachable. He accepted criticism without retaliation. He praised tradition. Rome rewarded him with goodwill. His early policies reinforced this image. He reduced burdens on provincial communities struggling after disasters. He intervened against corrupt tax collectors. He showed concern for grain supply and public welfare. None of this was revolutionary, but it was effective. Stability often mattered more than brilliance. Public games continued, but with a different tone. Nero used them to strengthen his connection with the people, not to intimidate them. He sponsored spectacles that entertained without cruelty. Gladiatorial combat did not disappear, but it was not emphasized. Instead, theater, music, and athletic displays gained prominence. The crowds responded positively. To many Romans, these years felt gentle. Nero's generosity became part of his image. He gave financial support to senators who had fallen below the property requirement, preserving their status and dignity. He declined the offer of holding the consulship for life, another gesture that reinforced the idea of shared governance. Rome valued rulers who knew when to refuse honors as much as when to accept them. Yet even in this calm, signs of imbalance appeared. Nero enjoyed praise, and he enjoyed performance. Applause energized him. The public's affection felt immediate and personal. Unlike the Senate's approval, which required patience and compromise, the crowd's response was direct. Nero began to sense where his true comfort lay. Seneca and Burrus worked quietly to maintain limits. They encouraged Nero to present himself as an emperor who ruled through law and reason. They discouraged excess. They reminded him that Rome valued restraint. For a time, Nero listened. Agrippina, however, struggled with this shift. She had helped build Nero's position, but she had not anticipated how quickly he would seek independence. Her presence began to feel intrusive rather than supportive. She spoke too openly. She reminded him of debts he no longer wished to acknowledge. Tension grew, though it remained controlled. And to the outside world, Rome still looked stable. These early years later became known as Nero's good period, not because everything was perfect, but because restraint still existed. The machinery of empire functioned, the provinces remained largely calm, the Senate felt included, the guard remained loyal. The people were fed and entertained. What Rome did not fully see was how fragile this balance was. Nero had never ruled without guidance. He had never faced sustained opposition. He had never been forced to test limits through failure. Power had arrived early and smoothly. That smoothness masked the absence of resistance. As time passed, Nero's interests began to drift further from the expectations placed upon him. Music, poetry, and performance were not passing hobbies. They were passions he practiced tirelessly. But he surrounded himself with others who shared his enthusiasm. These activities were still private, still contained, but they mattered deeply to him. Rome tolerated eccentricities in private. It judged harshly when they appeared in public. For now, the line held. Yet even in moments of harmony, Rome's history warned that such calm rarely lasted. Empires depended not only on good intentions, but on restraint sustained over time. Nero had not yet been tested by catastrophe, betrayal, or loss. Those tests were coming, and when they arrived, Rome would remember these early years with a kind of regret, wondering how a ruler who once promised balance had drifted so far from it. For the moment, though, Nero stood at the center of a peaceful illusion, praised as a young emperor who listened, who shared power, who ruled gently. The city enjoyed the calm, unaware of how much depended on forces already beginning to pull him in different directions. The applause Rome did not approve. Of Rome had always enjoyed entertainment. It had built arenas, theaters, and circuses on a scale unmatched in the ancient world. Yet there was a boundary Rome guarded carefully, a boundary that separated the audience from the ruler. Nero was beginning to press against that line. At first, it happened quietly. Nero's interest in music and poetry was not new. He had trained for years, practicing the lyre daily, studying rhythm and verse with the same discipline other young nobles applied to rhetoric or law. In private, this raised few concerns. Roman elites tolerated many personal indulgences provided they remained discreet. What unsettled them was not art itself, but visibility. Yet for a Roman aristocrat, public performance carried risk. For an emperor, it carried danger. The Roman ruling class valued control, restraint, and a particular image of masculinity. Authority was meant to appear effortless. A ruler commanded legions, judged disputes, and presided over rituals. He did not ask for applause. Applause came to him whether he wanted it or not. Nero, however, enjoyed the response. The sound of approval mattered to him in a way Senate praise never quite did. The crowd's reaction was immediate. It was honest in its own way. There were no speeches, no delays, no compromises, just sound. To Nero, this felt alive. At first, he kept his performances limited. Private gatherings, closed audiences, carefully selected guests. Even so, word spread quickly. Rome thrived on rumor. But the idea of an emperor who sang and played instruments unsettled some and thrilled others. Among younger Romans and the urban crowd, curiosity grew. Among senators, discomfort followed. This was not merely about taste. It was about status. Roman culture placed performers low on the social ladder. Actors, musicians, and dancers were admired, but they were not respected. To perform publicly was to place oneself closer to servants than rulers. Nero did not seem troubled by this distinction. Seneca and Burrus attempted to manage the situation. They advised restraint, suggesting that artistic expression remain controlled and symbolic rather than public. They understood the danger. Rome tolerated novelty only when it felt contained. Nero listened at first, but the pull was strong. To protect the dignity of his position, a compromise was arranged. The Augustiani were formed, a group of young equestrians tasked with attending Nero's performances and responding with enthusiasm. Their applause was coordinated, loud, and reassuring. The goal was to shape the audience rather than expose Nero to uncertainty. This solution revealed more than it concealed. If applause needed management, then approval was no longer organic. Senators noticed, so did the people. The sound of praise became predictable. Where applause once expressed emotion, it now expressed loyalty. Nero did not see this as deception, he saw it as support. Public games became another outlet. Nero invested heavily in festivals, music competitions, and performances modeled on Greek traditions. He admired Greek culture deeply, especially its celebration of artistic excellence. To him, Rome's suspicion of public performance felt narrow and outdated. Yet Rome was not Greece. Roman identity had been built on conquest, discipline, and civic duty. Greek refinement was admired, but it was also distrusted. Too much admiration risked appearing unmanly, indulgent, or detached from Roman seriousness. Nero's enthusiasm unsettled those who believed an emperor should embody restraint rather than expression. Still, the people enjoyed it. Crowds filled venues. Curiosity turned into excitement. Nero's presence electrified events. He did not merely sponsor games. He transformed them into shared experiences. His generosity with prizes, food, and entertainment strengthened his popularity among ordinary Romans. This popularity mattered. As Nero leaned more into public favor, the Senate's role subtly diminished. He still consulted them, or he still respected procedure. But his emotional center shifted toward the crowd. The Senate spoke in debates, the people responded in cheers. This shift alarmed the elite. Rome had seen populism before. Leaders who bypassed aristocratic approval often ended badly. The balance between ruler, senate, and people was delicate. Nero's growing reliance on applause threatened that balance. Agrippina watched this change with concern. She understood Rome's traditions better than Nero did. She warned him against excess. She criticized his attachments. Her tone became sharper. Nero's patience thinned. The relationship between mother and son strained under competing visions of power. Agrippina believed legitimacy came from tradition and lineage. Nero felt legitimacy in the crowd's response. Neither was entirely wrong, neither was entirely safe. But beyond the city, these developments were watched with interest. Provincial elites paid attention to Rome's mood. Governors understood that imperial favor followed visibility. Those who pleased Nero through cultural patronage found opportunities open. Those who resisted quietly stepped aside. Rome's political atmosphere grew more theatrical. Even Nero's nightly wanderings through the city took on symbolic meaning. Disguised, accompanied by companions, he explored taverns and streets, testing anonymity. At first, these outings seemed playful. Later, they grew rougher. Encounters turned violent. Senators were humiliated. Rumors multiplied. These incidents fed unease. Was Nero losing restraint? Or was Rome overreacting to a ruler who refused to behave as expected? Ancient writers would later shape these stories with dramatic emphasis. Some details may have been exaggerated, yet the pattern remains clear. Nero was pushing boundaries not to shock, but to feel engaged. The applause he sought was not merely vanity, it was connection. Rome, however, demanded distance from its rulers. Familiarity bred discomfort. The closer Nero moved toward the people, the more the elite withdrew. This widening gap marked a turning point. The calm years were giving way to tension. The system that had once supported Nero's rise now struggled to contain him. The question was no longer whether Nero could rule well. It was whether Rome could accept a ruler who wanted more than obedience. The applause continued. So did the unease. And Rome was learning that the sound it feared most was not silence, but clapping in the wrong places. The brother who could not grow old. In Rome, rivals did not need to shout. Sometimes they only needed to breathe. Britannicus was younger than Nero, quieter and far less visible. He did not command crowds. He did not appear on coinage with the same frequency. He did not speak in the Senate with practiced ease. Yet he carried something Nero could never fully erase: blood. He was Claudius's natural son. As long as Britannicus lived, an alternative future existed. It did not need to be realistic to be dangerous. Rome was a city that thrived on possibility. Senators whispered, courtiers calculated, loyalists waited. Even silence could be read as intent. For a time, Britannicus remained in the background, protected by youth and illness. He suffered from seizures which limited his public presence and softened perceptions of his readiness. In another era, this might have ensured safety, but in Nero's Rome, it created uncertainty. Agrippina understood the danger before Nero did. She had worked carefully to sideline Britannicus without provoking sympathy. But as Nero's independence grew, her control weakened. Their relationship strained. She spoke too sharply. She reminded him of debts he no longer wished to acknowledge. When power shifts, fear often follows. By the year 55 AD, the tension surrounding Britannicus sharpened. Nero had begun asserting his own preferences openly. He distanced himself from Claudius's memory. He challenged traditions his adoptive father had favored. These gestures were small, but they sent signals. Britannicus's supporters noticed. At a private dinner, Britannicus was invited to sing. His voice had recently deepened, marking his approach toward adulthood. The moment mattered. Point. Rome watched such signs closely. A boy's voice breaking meant a man approaching eligibility not just in age, but in expectation. The atmosphere reportedly shifted. What followed has been told many ways. Ancient sources describe poison slipped into Britannicus's drink, administered during the meal. They claim the boy collapsed suddenly, his body convulsing, his breathing failing. Nero, seated nearby, announced calmly that Britannicus was suffering from one of his usual seizures and would recover. He did not. Britannicus died that night. The next day, his body was cremated quickly before questions could gather weight. Official explanations followed. The Senate accepted them. Public mourning was restrained. Rome had seen this pattern before. Modern historians hesitate. Poison stories were common in Roman writing, especially when explaining sudden deaths near power. Britannicus's illness was real. A fatal seizure remains possible. Absolute certainty is unreachable. Yet certainty is not required for fear to work. What mattered was how Rome interpreted the event. Britannicus's death removed ambiguity. It ended alternative futures. Nero stood alone. Agrippina reacted with fury and alarm. She accused, she threatened. She reminded Nero of the consequences. In her anger, she reportedly spoke of championing Britannicus as the rightful heir, even after his death. Whether these threats were real or exaggerated later is unclear. What is clear is that Nero felt cornered. The relationship between mother and son broke irreparably. From this point forward, Nero no longer saw Agrippina as a guide. He saw her as a risk. Her access to supporters, her familiarity with power, her refusal to retreat quietly, all became sources of anxiety. Fear changes rulers. Nero began isolating her. Her image disappeared from coinage. Her influence waned. Senate meetings moved away from her presence. Guards once assigned to her were reassigned. The shifts were procedural, subtle, justified as administrative reforms. Yet the message was unmistakable. Agrippina resisted. She sought allies. She reminded others of her lineage, her service, her sacrifices. Some listened, others withdrew. In Rome, loyalty followed momentum. Meanwhile, Nero continued cultivating public favor. He distributed grain, he hosted games, he rewarded loyalty. Each act strengthened his bond with the people while weakening traditional restraints. Britannicus's death became a quiet, dividing line. Before it, Nero ruled with guidance and balance. After it, suspicion grew. Advisors like Seneca and Burrus remained influential, but their ability to restrain him weakened. They urged caution. They encouraged reconciliation. Nero listened selectively. The elite reacted cautiously. Few spoke openly. Many adjusted their behavior. Silence became a form of survival. Agrippina's position deteriorated further. She was moved out of the palace. Her access to Nero was restricted. Official explanations emphasized order and efficiency. Privately, fear ruled. For Nero, the removal of Britannicus solved one problem and created another. He was now unchallenged, but also exposed. Responsibility no longer had an alternative to deflect toward. Praise no longer felt shared. Blame, when it came, would be personal. Rome noticed the change. The emperor's mood darkened, and his patience shortened. His indulgences increased, his distrust widened. The careful balance that had marked his early years began to strain. And Agrippina, once the architect of his rise, now stood on the outside, watching the structure she built begin to close against her. In Roman imagination, certain acts carried cosmic weight. Killing a rival was grim but common. Removing a brother crossed a moral line few forgot. Even when the facts remained uncertain, the story endured. Britannicus became a symbol, whether he deserved it or not. His death marked the end of shared futures. From this point onward, Nero ruled alone. And alone, Rome's rulers rarely remained gentle for long. The mother who could not step aside. Rome could tolerate many things from its rulers. Excess, vanity, even cruelty when dressed in order. What it could not easily process was a mother who refused to disappear. Agrippina had built Nero's path with care, patience, and calculation. She had survived exile, court intrigue, and the quiet violence of political erasure. She had returned stronger. She had secured marriage, adoption, and succession. In her mind, her work was not finished simply because Nero now wore the purple. She believed guidance was still required. Nero believed it was no longer welcome. After Britannicus's death, the distance between them hardened. Agrippina no longer appeared beside her son in public. Her name faded from official documents. Her presence at court diminished. These changes were explained away as routine adjustments, but everyone understood their meaning. Power was being re-centered. Nero was asserting separation. Agrippina resisted quietly at first. She reminded senators of her lineage. She spoke of Germanicus. She recalled favors done and alliances forged. Some listened. Most nodded politely and withdrew. Rome was skilled at sensing which voices were safe to hear. Nero's advisors urged caution. Seneca favored distance without humiliation. Burrus favored order without violence. They understood the danger of turning Agrippina into a martyr. Nero agreed in theory. In practice, his patience was thin. The situation worsened when accusations began to circulate. Agrippina was said to be gathering supporters among the Praetorian Guard. She was accused of harboring alternative claimants, including distant relatives of Augustus. Whether these claims were real or exaggerated mattered less than the fear they generated. Nero panicked, and he considered immediate action. For a moment, the empire hovered on the edge of irreversible bloodshed. Burrus refused to act without proof. Seneca insisted on procedure. Agrippina was summoned and questioned. She defended herself calmly, reminding those present of her service, her sacrifices, and her loyalty. The accusations collapsed under scrutiny. Nero backed down. Publicly, Agrippina was spared. Privately, trust was gone. Nero expelled her from the palace soon after, citing disruption and protocol. She moved to another residence on the Palatine, close enough to remain visible, far enough to feel excluded. Her guards were reassigned, her access narrowed, her influence drained away through administrative reforms that appeared neutral but were carefully aimed. Rome watched closely. In Roman culture, mothers were revered, but only within limits. A mother who advised was acceptable. A mother who influenced succession was tolerated. A mother who refused to relinquish authority was dangerous. Agrippina had crossed that final boundary. Nero's resentment deepened. He began to view her not as a protector, but as a rival. Her presence reminded him of debts he wished to forget. Her memory of his dependency unsettled him. Power, once tasted alone, resists sharing. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed Agrippina planned Nero's death. Others said she sought to replace him. Ancient writers amplified these fears, often blending truth with drama. What matters is not whether Agrippina truly plotted, but that Nero believed she might. Fear accelerates decisions. The first attempt to remove her was indirect. A mechanical scheme was designed to cause a fatal accident, disguised as misfortune. It failed. Another plan followed, involving a vessel meant to collapse at sea. That too failed. Agrippina survived, injured but alive. Her survival intensified Nero's terror. In Roman storytelling, fate punishes hesitation. Nero interpreted each failure as a warning. If he did not act decisively, he believed he would become the victim. The presence of advisors no longer restrained him. Fear drowned caution. The final act was brutal and unambiguous. Soldiers were sent to Agrippina's residence. She understood what was happening before they spoke. According to tradition, she faced them calmly. She did not plead, she did not run. She exposed her body and told them where to strike, naming the womb that had borne the emperor. Whether every detail is true matters less than what the story represented. A matricide shattered a moral boundary Rome rarely crossed. Killing rivals was politics. Killing mothers was tragedy. The act resonated far beyond the immediate event. It disturbed even those who approved of Agrippina's removal. Nero attempted to control the narrative. A letter was sent to the Senate explaining that Agrippina had plotted against him and died by her own actions. The Senate responded with relief rather than outrage. Official thanks were offered. Public ceremonies marked deliverance from alleged danger. Rome chose stability over moral clarity. The people did not revolt. The guard remained loyal. The Senate complied. In Rome, outrage often dissolved when order was preserved. Nero returned to the city to applause, sacrifices, and ritual celebration. Yet something had shifted permanently. The restraint that once shaped Nero's rule vanished. The last figure who could challenge him emotionally and symbolically was gone. Seneca and Burrus remained, but their influence weakened. Nero no longer feared disapproval. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The empire did not collapse that day. Life continued. Games were held, laws passed. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet unease settled. Romans believed that certain acts invited divine attention. Matricide belonged among them. Omens were watched more closely. Whispers grew darker. Nero himself seemed restless, haunted, driven to distraction by performance, spectacle, and excess. Agrippina's death marked the end of Nero's youth. From this point onward, he ruled without a counterweight. His desires no longer met resistance strong enough to slow them, and the system that had lifted him now struggled to restrain him. Rome had removed a dangerous woman. In doing so, it had also removed the last barrier between Nero and himself. When Rome burned and memory took fire, fire was not unusual in Rome. What was unusual was how long this one was remembered. On a warm night in July of 64 AD, flames rose near the Circus Maximus, in a part of the city packed tightly with wooden shops, narrow streets and shared housing. Wind carried the fire quickly, buildings fed it easily. Panic spread faster than orders. Rome, dense and restless, became fuel. When word reached Nero, he was not in the city. He was staying at Antium, the same coastal town where he had been born. The distance mattered later because memory often ignores logistics. Nero returned to Rome as soon as he could. Ancient sources agree on this much, even when they disagree on motive. What followed was chaos. The fire raged for days. Of Rome's 14 districts, only a handful escaped damage. Whole neighborhoods vanished. Families fled with what they could carry. Some took refuge in open spaces. Others slept under the sky, watching their city glow. Nero threw himself into relief efforts. He opened public buildings and his own gardens to the displaced. Grain was brought in. Prices were lowered. Temporary shelters were arranged. These actions were recorded by historians who were otherwise hostile to him, which suggests they were real. Yet, relief does not erase suspicion. Rome needed someone to blame. The city had burned before, but this time the scale was overwhelming. The trauma demanded explanation. Rumors spread quickly, and some claimed men were seen preventing firefighting efforts. Others claimed songs were heard as flames rose. Stories multiplied, each more dramatic than the last. Nero became the focus. Later writers would shape these rumors into lasting images. The idea of Nero playing music while Rome burned lodged itself in popular imagination. Whether he sang, recited poetry, or did nothing at all became less important than the symbolism. The story fit an image that had been forming for years, an emperor more interested in performance than restraint. Reality was more complicated. Rome was built to burn. Wooden beams, overhanging floors, crowded alleys and shared walls created perfect conditions for disaster. The Vigiles, Rome's firefighting force, existed but were limited. They lacked the tools to stop a blaze of this scale. Wind ignored authority. After the fire subsided, Nero faced a decision that would shape his reputation permanently. Rebuilding Rome was unavoidable. The city could not remain in ruins. Nero introduced new regulations. Streets were widened, building materials were restricted, fire breaks were mandated. These reforms were practical, even progressive. Yet alongside rebuilding came ambition. Nero claimed a vast tract of land in the city's heart for a new palace complex. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, sprawled across hills and valleys filled with gardens, artificial lakes, and rooms adorned with gold and frescoes. It was not merely a residence, it was a statement. To many Romans it felt like proof. Even if Nero had not caused the fire, the palace made it appear convenient. The contrast between public loss and private luxury was too stark. Anger found shape, grief found direction. Nero likely believed he was reshaping Rome for the future. Others believed he was reshaping it for himself. Suspicion hardened. The emperor's attempts to manage perception struggled against emotion. Relief efforts were remembered briefly. The Golden House was remembered vividly. Memory favors symbols. As resentment grew, Nero and his advisors sought a way to redirect blame. Rome's anger needed release. In times of crisis, societies often look for outsiders, those who refuse to conform. The Christian community fit that role. Christians were still a small group in Rome, poorly understood and deeply mistrusted. They refused to participate in public religious rituals. They met in private. They spoke of a kingdom beyond Rome. To traditional Romans, this felt dangerous. Religious unity was tied to civic safety. Our refusal to honor the gods was seen as inviting disaster. Accusations followed. Christians were blamed for the fire. Arrests began. Punishments were severe and public. Some were executed in cruel displays meant to reassure the population that justice was being done. These spectacles shocked even those accustomed to Roman violence. The blame worked, but imperfectly. While the immediate anger softened, doubts remained. Many Romans pitied the victims. Others suspected manipulation. Nero's image suffered regardless. The fire became inseparable from his name. Internally, Nero changed. The disaster shook him. Whether haunted by guilt, fear, or frustration, he became more withdrawn and erratic. His indulgences increased. His reliance on spectacle deepened. Performance became both refuge and assertion. Rome, meanwhile, to rebuilt itself physically while emotionally fracturing. The city emerged with straighter streets and stricter codes, but trust eroded. The Senate grew uneasy. The elite resented the palace. The people remembered the flames. In Roman thinking, disasters carried moral weight. They were read as signs, not accidents. Omens were discussed. Comets were watched. Priests were consulted. Nero's rule began to feel cursed in the minds of many. Yet the empire did not fall. Life resumed. Trade continued. Provinces paid taxes. The machinery of power kept turning. Rome had endured fires before. It would endure again. But something fundamental had shifted. The fire did not destroy Nero's reign in a single stroke. Instead, it transformed how his actions were interpreted. Every gesture afterward passed through suspicion. Yet every display of luxury felt offensive. Every performance felt inappropriate. Fire had burned buildings. Memory burned legitimacy. From this point forward, Nero ruled in a Rome that no longer trusted his intentions, even when his actions were practical. The distance between emperor and city widened, and in that widening space, opposition would soon take shape. Blame needs a body. After the fire, Rome rebuilt its walls and streets. What proved harder to rebuild was trust. The flames had taken more than homes and temples. They had exposed how fragile confidence in authority could be. Nero remained emperor, his powers intact, his guard loyal, his senate obedient. Yet something essential had shifted. People watched him differently now. Every decision seemed to carry a hidden motive. Every display of wealth felt like an insult to loss. But in this climate, fear became political currency. Rome had long practiced the art of assigning blame. When disaster struck, responsibility rarely remained abstract. Someone had to carry it, preferably someone few would defend. The choice of Christians followed a pattern Rome had used before, even if the scale this time was unprecedented. Christians were not new to the city, but they were unfamiliar in a way that unsettled Romans. They met privately, they rejected public sacrifice, they spoke of loyalty to a god beyond the state. In a culture where religion and civic order were inseparable, this refusal felt dangerous. Rome tolerated many gods, but it demanded participation. When Nero's administration pointed toward this community, it offered the city something it desperately needed: a target. Arrests began quietly, then publicly. The punishments were staged as reassurance. Executions were meant to demonstrate that order had been restored, that the gods had been appeased, that the emperor had acted decisively. For many Romans, this worked. Anger softened, anxiety eased, yet discomfort lingered. Some observers noticed that the punishment seemed excessive, even by Roman standards. Others sensed opportunism. Nero's reputation did not recover. Blame diverted attention, but it did not restore confidence. At the same time, opposition elsewhere in the empire began to surface. Far from Rome, in Britain, tensions had been building for years. Roman administration relied heavily on local client rulers, men allowed to govern under imperial oversight. When one such ruler, Prasutagus of the Iceni, died, his will attempted compromise, naming Nero as co-heir alongside his daughters. Roman officials ignored the spirit of this arrangement. Land was seized, property confiscated, tribal leaders humiliated. Prasutagus's widow, Boudica, resisted. She was flogged. Her daughters were assaulted. These acts were not ordered from Rome, but they were done in Rome's name. The response was swift and violent. Boudica united neighboring tribes. Roman settlements were overrun. Camulodunum fell first, then Londinium, then Verulamium. Temples burned. Colonists were killed. Roman power in Britain appeared fragile. Nero was blamed, even though the causes lay deeper than his personal rule. Imperial systems functioned through local officials. Abuse at the edges reflected back to the center. Eventually, Roman legions regrouped. The rebellion was crushed. Boudica died, likely by poison. Rome reasserted control. But the episode revealed how quickly authority could fracture when resentment met opportunity. At nearly the same time, unrest simmered in Judea. Tensions there were long-standing, rooted in taxation, governance, and religious autonomy. Roman officials struggled to manage a population deeply committed to its traditions and resistant to external control. Small incidents escalated, violence spread, garrisons were attacked. Nero appointed Vespasian to restore order, a decision that would later prove ironic. Campaigns were launched, cities fell. Jerusalem was besieged, though its final destruction would come after Nero's death. These revolts were not coordinated, they did not form a unified challenge to Rome, yet together they signaled strain. Rome's empire was vast, but its authority depended on perception as much as force. When fear spread, when blame circulated, when legitimacy felt unstable, cracks appeared. Back in Rome, Nero responded as he often did, with generosity and display. He offered gifts, he sponsored games, he distributed grain. These actions pleased the people, but they unsettled the elite. Senators watched resources flow into spectacle rather than restraint. The divide widened. The Senate remained outwardly loyal, but conversations changed tone. Informers grew bolder, accusations multiplied, treason laws once softened crept back into use. Fear fed itself. Nero, increasingly isolated, relied on a smaller circle of advisors. Some encouraged indulgence, others encouraged suspicion. Balance was harder to maintain. Public punishments continued. Executions served as warnings. Spectacle became reassurance. Order was maintained through visibility. And yet Rome sensed something unresolved. The emperor appeared active, generous, decisive. But beneath that surface, trust had thinned. Each crisis was managed individually, but no longer absorbed quietly. The memory of fire lingered. The memory of blame lingered. The empire felt restless. Nero's rule had not collapsed. It had changed character. Where once cooperation defined his early years, now control did. Where once moderation guided policy, now reaction did. The system still functioned, but it no longer felt secure. In Rome, this stage often preceded conspiracy. When fear saturates politics, when blame becomes routine, when loyalty feels performative rather than genuine, plots emerge not always from ambition, but from desperation. Nero did not yet face open rebellion in Italy, but the conditions were forming. Senators whispered, its soldiers watched. Provinces tested limits. Blame had found bodies. Now it would find voices, and those voices would soon speak loudly enough to threaten everything Nero had left. When fear learned to whisper, Rome did not announce its turning points with trumpets. It announced them with silence. By the mid-60s AD, Nero still ruled, still issued decrees, still appeared in public. Yet something subtle had changed. People listened differently now. Applause came on cue. Praise sounded practiced. Behind closed doors, voices lowered. Fear had learned to whisper. The Senate continued to meet, but its confidence had thinned. Senators had survived Caligula by keeping quiet and Claudius by staying useful. Under Nero, the rules felt less predictable, not because punishment was constant, but because it seemed increasingly personal. A favor could rise suddenly, disgrace could follow just as quickly. Informers returned to prominence. Rome had always lived with denunciations, but now they carried renewed weight. Accusations of disloyalty, ambition, or improper speech circulated. Some were sincere, many were strategic. Fear made people cautious, but it also made them cruel. Survival encouraged preemption. Nero, for his part, listened too much and too little at the same time. He suspected plots everywhere, yet dismissed genuine warnings. His advisors no longer agreed. Burrus had died, removing a stabilizing presence. Seneca, increasingly withdrawn, struggled to influence decisions. New figures gained access, men who encouraged indulgence and flattered insecurity. The court atmosphere thickened. At night, Nero's restlessness returned. Yet he moved through the city less playfully now, more tensely. Encounters ended poorly, slights felt sharper, insults lingered longer, power without trust grows brittle. Then came the conspiracy. Gaius Calpurnius Piso was not an obvious revolutionary. He was wealthy, well-connected, and popular among certain elites. He did not plot out of desperation alone, but out of frustration shared quietly by many. Nero's rule had not collapsed, but it no longer felt tolerable to some. The plot itself was clumsy, sprawling, and uncertain. It relied on coordination between senators, equestrians, and officers of the Praetorian Guard. It depended on timing, secrecy, and luck. It also depended on silence, something Rome struggled to maintain. A woman named Epicharis broke that silence. She attempted to recruit support within the fleet. And when her effort failed, suspicion followed. Arrests began. Under pressure, names surfaced. Fear spread faster than loyalty. The conspiracy unraveled. Nero reacted swiftly. Piso was ordered to die. Others followed. Executions multiplied. Some were granted the option of suicide, preserving a measure of dignity. Others were killed outright. Rome watched familiar names vanish. Seneca was implicated. Whether he truly participated remains uncertain. Ancient sources disagreed even then. What mattered was perception. Seneca had shaped Nero's early image. His presence reminded the emperor of restraint and obligation. In a climate of fear, reminders feel dangerous. Nero ordered Seneca's death. The philosopher met his end calmly, opening his veins as tradition allowed, attempting to model Stoic acceptance. His death resonated deeply. It signaled that no relationship, no service, no history offered protection. The last thread connecting Nero to moderation snapped. After the conspiracy, Nero did not regain confidence. He tightened control. Executions continued, accusations multiplied, rewards were offered to informers, loyalty became performative, silence became suspicious, even praise carried risk if it sounded excessive or insincere. The Senate retreated further. At the same time, Nero's attachment to spectacle intensified. He sought affirmation where he still found it, in performance. He expanded festivals, he increased participation, he blurred lines deliberately, inviting elites to appear on stage alongside him. Refusal carried consequences. To some, this felt like humiliation. To Nero, it felt like unity. The empire's edges continued to strain. Revolts were contained, but unease persisted. Military victories no longer brought reassurance. Governors watched one another. Ambition stirred quietly. In this environment, Nero planned escape. He spoke of traveling east of Greece, of festivals and honors that would welcome him openly. Greek cities admired artistry. They celebrated performance. There, he believed, his talents would be recognized without judgment. Rome watched him prepare and grew uneasy. An emperor who left Italy for extended periods signaled confidence or abandonment. Nero insisted governance would continue smoothly. He trusted freedmen and prefects to manage affairs. The Senate did not object openly. It rarely did anymore. Nero's journey east was a triumph of applause and excess. Festivals were rearranged to accommodate him. Prizes accumulated. Honors piled high. He performed constantly. He won constantly. The praise was overwhelming. But distance sharpened resentment back home. In Nero's absence, whispers grew louder. Loyalty thinned. Military commanders gauged opportunity. Governors calculated advantage. The emperor's indulgence abroad contrasted sharply with Rome's unease. When Nero returned, he was celebrated publicly, but the tone felt forced. He did not stay long. He withdrew again, spending time away from the city, trusting that authority still held. It did, but barely. The machinery of empire functioned, but belief was fading. Nero had survived rebellion, fire, and conspiracy. What he had not survived was erosion. Trust does not collapse suddenly, it drains. By the time news arrived of open defiance in the provinces, Nero's support was fragile. Galba declared allegiance to the Senate rather than the emperor. Others followed. The Praetorian Guard hesitated. Promises mattered more than history. Fear, once whispered, now spoke clearly. Nero found himself isolated. Advisors fled. Guards withdrew. Messages stopped arriving. The palace emptied quietly. The emperor, who once commanded applause, now faced silence. Rome had not risen against him in rage. It had stepped away. And in Rome, abandonment was the final verdict. The night, Rome walked away. Power rarely ends with noise. More often, it ends with absence. By the spring of 68 AD, Nero was still emperor in title, but the structure beneath him had thinned to the point of transparency. Orders were issued, yet responses slowed. Messages were sent, yet confirmations never came. The rhythm of empire, once steady, now stumbled. When the first clear break came from the provinces, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor in Gaul, raised the banner of opposition. He did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he claimed loyalty to the Senate and the Roman people, positioning his defiance as moral rather than personal. That distinction mattered. It allowed others to follow without appearing ambitious. Nero dismissed the news at first. Revolts had occurred before. Legions existed to crush them. He delayed addressing the Senate, choosing instead to speak about architectural plans and entertainments. To him, the rebellion felt distant, manageable, temporary. Then Galba spoke. From Hispania, Servius Sulpicius Galba declared his allegiance not to Nero but to Rome itself. Unlike Vindex, Galba carried weight. He was experienced, respected, and connected. His declaration transformed dissent into a viable alternative. Support followed quickly. Governors hesitated, then shifted. Officers waited, then moved. Messages stopped referring to Nero as princeps. The language of loyalty changed subtly, then openly. The Senate listened carefully and said nothing. Nero's response was confused. He attempted to rally forces. He ordered legions to move. He spoke of leading troops himself, not as a general, but as a presence. At one point, he considered joining the army with musical instruments and performers, imagining morale could be lifted through spectacle. The idea revealed how far removed he had become from military reality. Behind the scenes, betrayal completed its work. Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, began negotiating his own future, yet he promised the guard rewards if they supported Galba. The Praetorians had always followed incentive as much as loyalty. Nero had once understood this. Now he assumed allegiance was permanent. It was not. One night, Nero went to sleep, still guarded. He woke to silence. The Praetorian camp had withdrawn its support. Servants had vanished. Advisors were gone. The palace felt hollow. The emperor wandered its corridors, calling out names that no longer answered. Rome had already decided. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. They revived an ancient punishment reserved for traitors. News of this sentence reached Nero as he fled the city with a handful of freedmen and companions. The empire he had ruled was no longer his refuge. He sought shelter at a villa outside Rome. There, as dawn approached, reality settled in. Escape was unlikely. His support was gone. Capture promised humiliation and death. The emperor, who once commanded the world, faced a choice Rome had offered many fallen elites: die by one's own hand or suffer public disgrace. Nero hesitated. Despite years of indulgence and excess, he was not fearless. He wept, he paced, he lamented the loss of friends who had already betrayed him. He practiced dying, pressing a dagger to his throat and withdrawing again. In the end, help came not from Rome, but from a freedman. With assistance, Nero ended his life on the 9th day of June, 68 AD. His final words, recorded and repeated, expressed regret not for cruelty or failure, but for art. Whether spoken exactly as remembered matters less than why they endured. Nero saw himself, even at the end, as a performer misunderstood by his audience. His death passed quietly, and there was no grand funeral, no public mourning. His body was claimed by a former lover and 2 nurses who had cared for him as a child. They prepared his remains with dignity. His ashes were placed in a family tomb. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line left the world without ceremony. Rome did not pause. Almost immediately, chaos followed. Galba entered the city only to fall months later. Others rose and fell. The year became a sequence of emperors, each claiming legitimacy, each struggling to hold power. Civil war loomed, stability vanished. Only then did Romans begin to reconsider Nero. Some missed the games, some missed the generosity. Some remembered the years before fear had settled in. Others repeated the stories of fire, cruelty, and madness. Memory divided along lines of loss and privilege. Historians shaped the narrative, but writers like Tacitus and Suetonius, senators themselves, framed Nero as a warning. Their accounts blended fact, rumor, and moral judgment. They wrote with purpose, reminding future rulers what happened when emperors rejected elite values. Yet the people remembered differently. False Neros appeared in the East. Men claiming to be the fallen emperor returned. Crowds supported them. Songs were sung. Nostalgia lingered. This contradiction puzzled later generations. How could a ruler so condemned also be missed? The answer lies not in innocence or guilt, but in complexity. Nero ruled during transition. He inherited a system still pretending to be republican. He exposed its contradictions. He favored art where Rome favored control. He sought connection where Rome demanded distance. His failure was not singular, it was systemic. Rome had raised a child through ceremony, applause, and performance, then punished him for taking those lessons seriously. It had rewarded visibility, then condemned indulgence. It had accepted fear as governance, then recoiled from its consequences. Nero died abandoned but not entirely rejected. His story lingered because it refused to settle into a single meaning. Monster, artist, tyrant, reformer, victim, villain. Each label captured part of him, none captured all. And so Rome moved on, carrying Nero with it, not as a resolved memory, but as an unresolved question. What Rome needed Nero to be, history did not remember Nero by accident. It remembered him because it needed him. When Rome spoke of Nero after his death, it was not only recounting events, it was performing an act of reassurance. Fires, executions, conspiracies, collapse. These things demanded explanation. Rome could not blame its systems. It could not blame its traditions. It could not blame the slow erosion of trust that had been building for generations. It was far easier to blame one man. Nero became that vessel. Ancient writers shaped him carefully. They selected stories that reinforced moral lessons. Excess became obsession. Performance became madness. Fear became cruelty. Each story made sense on its own. Together they formed a warning tale meant to discipline future rulers and comfort a shaken elite. Yet this version of Nero does not fully explain the contradictions. It does not explain why crowds cheered him long after senators despised him. It does not explain why impostors claiming to be Nero appeared years after his death and found followers. Point: it does not explain why some provinces mourned him while Rome erased him. Those reactions suggest something uncomfortable. Nero was not simply rejected, he was divided. To the Senate he was dangerous because he blurred boundaries. He listened to the crowd. He treated performance as connection rather than humiliation. He bypassed traditional channels of approval. In doing so, he threatened a ruling class that depended on distance to survive. To the people Nero felt present. He fed them, he entertained them, he shared visibility. He appeared in public not as an untouchable figure, but as someone who wanted to be seen and heard. In a city accustomed to rulers who hid behind ritual, this felt refreshing. Neither side was entirely wrong. Rome's political structure demanded restraint, yet rewarded display. It claimed to value shared governance, yet punished dissent. It elevated children through ceremony, then condemned them for immaturity. Nero absorbed these contradictions from birth. He did not invent them. The tragedy of Nero's reign lies not only in what he did, but in what he revealed. He showed how fragile legitimacy becomes when it relies on appearance rather than trust. He showed how fear corrodes even well-intentioned systems. He showed how performance can substitute for connection and how applause can replace dialogue. His artistic passions were not crimes. They became crimes because Rome decided an emperor should never need approval. Nero needed it deeply. That need shaped his choices for better and for worse. His cruelty, when it appeared, was real. Lives were lost. Suffering occurred. None of that should be softened. Yet cruelty alone does not explain collapse. Rome had endured worse under rulers it tolerated. What Rome could not tolerate was exposure. Nero exposed the fiction at the heart of imperial rule, that power could remain absolute while pretending to be shared. That emperors could be both distant and beloved, that legitimacy could be inherited without performance. Nero treated these contradictions as negotiable. Rome treated them as sacred. When crisis came, Rome did what it always did. It withdrew support quietly. It allowed abandonment to do the work violence once did. Nero did not fall because Rome rose against him. He fell because Rome stepped away. And then, having stepped away, Rome rewrote the story. It remembered Nero as a tyrant because that story restored moral order. It remembered him as mad because madness absolved the system. It remembered him as monstrous because monsters can be removed without reflection. Yet memory never fully obeys. In taverns, people spoke differently. In provinces, songs lingered. In whispers, Nero became something else, a ruler who gave, who appeared, who listened. These memories were not accurate either. They were emotional. Between these two versions, tyrant and lost favorite, lies the real Nero. A man shaped early by ceremony, applause, fear, and expectation. A ruler who never learned how to exist without an audience. An emperor raised to perform power, then punished for believing performance mattered. So how should Nero be remembered? Not as innocent, not as purely cruel, but as symptomatic. He was the result of a system that demanded spectacle and feared intimacy. A system that rewarded early elevation and punished late self-discovery. A system that taught rulers to seek approval, then condemned them for doing so. Rome survived Nero. Empires often survive their contradictions. But the year that followed his death exposed how fragile stability had become. Civil war followed. Emperors rose and fell. Legitimacy fractured openly. In that sense, Nero did not end an era alone. He revealed its weakness. And perhaps that is why his story still unsettles. It refuses to rest. It challenges simple judgment. It asks uncomfortable questions about power, performance, and memory. If Nero had ruled longer, would Rome have adapted? If Rome had adapted sooner, would Nero have fallen? These questions have no answers, only echoes. What remains is a mirror. Nero forces us to ask not only who he was, but what Rome expected its rulers to be, and whether any individual could survive those expectations without breaking. As the empire moved on, it buried Nero quietly, but it never fully buried the problem he exposed, and that is why, centuries later, his name still burns. Not because he lit the fire, but because Rome needed someone to hold the flame. As the night grows quieter and Rome fades back into memory, there is no verdict waiting for you here. Nero does not ask to be forgiven, nor does he demand condemnation. He asks something far more unsettling. He asks to be understood, because when we strip away the rumors, the slogans, the rehearsed outrage, what remains is not a monster born in fire, but a man shaped by a system that taught him how to perform power, and then punished him for believing the performance mattered. Rome did not fall because of Nero, but Nero fell because Rome could not decide what it wanted its rulers to be. Strong but not distant, loved but not familiar, human but never flawed. Those contradictions did not die with him. They drift forward, quietly, into every age that follows. So as you rest tonight, let one final thought linger. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to keep company with your sleep. How often do we create the figures we later blame? And how many fires in history were lit not by one hand, but by expectation itself? Thank you for spending this time with Slumber Scrolls. If the story stays with you, let it. If it fades, that's all right too. History doesn't need to be remembered loudly. Sometimes it's enough that it was heard. Sleep well.